All right, in this video, we're going to talk about urban forensic entomology. If you have not watched the video on stored product forensic entomology, please go back and do that. You can watch this out of turn and still get information, but there are going to be some themes and topics that are very similar in urban forensic entomology as they are in stored product. So proceed with caution if you haven't watched it, but if you can, go back and watch Stored Product if you haven't yet. Very much like Stored Product forensic entomology, there is aspects of civil, criminal, and administrative law. The main difference is where stored product entomology is looking at infestation of food products. Urban forensic entomology is looking at the infestation of a urban structure. So this is typically anything that's enclosed that is used by humans. So a lot of times we're thinking about living spaces, but it can be things that we use recreationally as well. Now, the types of cases that can involve urban entomology are quite diverse. So the majority of the ones that we can think of or that are seen are things called urban infestations, right? So these are the instances where you are trying to determine who's at fault for an infestation, just like we do in stored product entomology. So a good example is if you have a tenant and a landlord, and they have an agreement on pest management. So the landlord is supposed to be for pest management and prevention. And the tenant is supposed to ensure that they have a living space that does not entice infestation, right? And so, say there's cockroaches that are now in the house, and the tenant says that it is the fault of the landlord can make the argument that the living space is conducive for an infestation. The stored product, or the urban forensic entomologist would then come in and assess who is right in this situation. Other things that we can look at is off-label use of pesticides. That becomes really problematic when we're talking about how different pest control companies place down their pesticide. You can have nuisance claims, and this really talks about how someone's actions or behaviors lead to pest species to accumulate in one area, and that becomes a bother for someone else. So, for instance, your neighbor has a lot of trash, they have a lot of filth flies, and you're very cleanly, you don't want any flies in your area, then a nuisance claim would be you taking that person to arbitration to try and sort that out. And then, of course, there are instances where people are treated poorly. And so one of these ways that involve urban entomology is mortuary neglect. So this is usually where insects colonize human remains in an urban setting. So it's very similar to medical legal entomology, but not quite the same. Even go into this, we need to discuss what a pest species is. And that's because it's a very arbitrary term, right? So we think mosquitoes are a pest. We do not like them, but there are plenty of organisms that eat them as a primary resource, right? So they aren't a pest to quote unquote everyone. But there are different species of insects that can actually be beneficial that are considered pest species to other people. For example, blowflies are pollinators. So we're going to be talking a lot about these filth flies, but they do an actual ecosystem service, but they're considered a pest because we don't like them and we affiliate them with bad things. Okay, so usually when we define what a pest is, it is very subjective based off of our goals, right? So it's very political. So usually when we have pest species, they are usually considered to be destructive in some way. When we're talking about in urban environments, it needs to be an infrastructure issue. and they influence either humans or some type of domestic animal, including livestock's health. And they're considered a nuisance. So they just are annoying. So they are in high abundances. We don't like them. So if they meet this criteria, we then consider them a pest species. All right. So when you rent a home or an apartment, there is something called implied warranty of habitability. So every U.S. state has some type of law that ensures that the home that you are renting does not have an inherent health risk to you during the time of your stay. So this looks a little bit different, and the language is a little bit different per state. And so I wanted to show Massachusetts. I grew up in Massachusetts. I worked for a little bit in Massachusetts. So I really like the wording of this. And this is just an example, but every state has its own version of this. So just to read it, ensure that rental properties with 2 or more units are free from rodents, skunks, and insect infestations, including cockroaches. I don't know why they call out cockroaches and not other insects, but it's really clear and concise. So the fact, or in the instance that you have an insect infestation, under this law, you can sue the landlord. Okay. Usually, you have to go about this if you go into an infested home. If you're living there for, say, a year and then it becomes infested, that's where it gets a little hairy, because then it's who's responsible for that. So what ends up happening, and this could be just for your own information as someone who's probably renting or will rent at some point in your life, if you ever go into a home that you are renting and there is an infestation, you are to first contact the landlord because they legally have the right to respond. Okay, so if you don't do that, you can't actually end up in a lawsuit. Um, if they end up responding, right, they can either fix the issue or they can choose not to. And choosing not to can look in a bunch of different ways. They can ignore you, they can tell you no, or they can do something that looks like it's helping, but is super cheap. It just kind of looks like it to shut you up, but it doesn't actually do anything. Okay. In that instance, you are legally within your right to withhold rent. You can actually fix the problem yourself and deduct that cost from the rent. You can sue them, or you can actually report them for an inspection, and then they will end up prosecuting. Just like in stored product entomology, you'll have your health inspector come in. If they see an issue, they'd report it to the FDA, things like that. Now, the tricky thing is, and we haven't talked about this in stored product entomology, and it's true there, it's a much smaller scale, so it's a little bit easier to identify what an infestation is. But in an urban setting, it's sometimes difficult to identify like what is an actual infestation versus what is a temporary couple individuals that you see, all of these different things. So the main thing is just because you see something doesn't mean you have an infestation, and it doesn't mean you have an automatic right to sue your landlord. Okay, and a good example of this, there are a lot of different cockroach species. People oftentimes mistake those cockroaches for the species that infest homes, but they actually end up being wood roaches, right? So don't just jump to suing your landlord because of this, or freaking out and like sending them things and yelling at them, all these things. It doesn't help. So there is a level of insects that you can have, just like in food, that makes it so you're not necessarily exposed to some type of health risk. So that's just something to consider. So we just talked about what you can do as a tenant to sue your landlord. Okay, but what if it's the tenant and not the landlord that's responsible? So if the tenant is responsible, the first, or potentially responsible, the first thing you need to do is look at that lease agreement, because that's going to tell whether or not it is the tenant's or the landlord's responsibility for pest management. So sometimes in that lease, they will say it's the tenant's responsibility. They will also look into the condition of the home. So if you are super cluttered, you have a bunch of trash on the floor, and you have cockroaches, no one's going to feel sorry for you, type thing. Or if you brought in a bunch of secondhand furniture, which, hint, hint, do not buy secondhand furniture. You will get bed bugs. That is just asking for it. And say you bought a bunch of secondhand furniture and now you're trying to sue your landlord for this bed bug infestation, but you had actually brought them in from outside. Then that's the issue. Then you can also consider the condition of the structure of the building that you're in. This is kind of tricky. So if you have damaged the structure as the tenant, it would be your fault. If the structure was compromised and then there was an infestation, then it's the landlord's responsibility. If a tenant is responsible, they can be sued by that landlord, and vice versa. So again, like, you can have countersuits. This happens all the time. So it just depends on who issues it first. So a landlord can initiate and then a tenant can countersue, vice versa. But oftentimes these scenarios are really dynamic, and it becomes really challenging to actually make determinations on who's responsible. Okay, let's quickly go over some common species and why they're important in these scenarios. We'll actually talk about the infamous cockroaches. As mentioned earlier, there are a lot of species of cockroaches, thousands as a matter of fact. Majority of them are harmless and actually colonize things like trees and leaf litter. So anything like dead plant matter. The ones that infest homes are the ones that give everything else a bad rap. Now, here's the top 3 that we'll find in the Northeast. There are other species. There are 2 other species that are not listed here that are very, very common, especially in the South. But for the sake of simplicity, I wanted to highlight these 3. So cockroaches are social insects. They will have these large colonies that they are caring for each other, and they are lovers of people. So anthrophilic means human loving, right? So they like living with us. And so they will eat our food materials and share our walls with us and our pet food and all of these different things. They will eat everything we do. And so you have really small species like the German cockroach. And in the Northeast, the oriental cockroach is probably the largest cockroach you will get. They are all oftentimes found in bathrooms in really wet areas. German cockroaches are horrible because once they infest your house, they're nearly impossible to get rid of. And then in the South or the mid East Coast, you'll start to see American cockroaches. These are really, really large cockroaches. They will infest homes, but they're less likely to do so when you compare it to the German cockroach. So again, cockroaches that you will are more likely to see in urban dwellings. Depending on the species you have different number of eggs and days that you will see or it will take to complete that life cycle. Every single cockroach will deposit an oothiki. Well, I should say every female will deposit an oothiki. These are little egg sacs, and they are hard, so they are a little sclerotized and thickened, walled material that they will place in dark areas. So if you have an infestation in your home, the easiest place to find that actual infestation is looking for oothiki under your sink bed, because they'll sneak up in there and they'll place them right there. They will emerge as nymphs, and they will molt until they grow wings and become a reproductive adult. So again, depending on the species you have, you're going to have differences in the completion of this life cycle. So German cockroaches have very, very short turnarounds, and so 7 months you'll get a whole new set of adults. And so that can be a problem because once they infest, they're the ones that are notoriously hard to get rid of. Now, the Oriental and American cockroach live much longer. And so it becomes almost a little bit easier to treat for them, for more reasons than just this. But because their life cycle is a little bit slower, you're not seeing as big of a boom in the population, unless you're getting multiple colonization events in the dwelling. Now, for treatment, prevention really is key. So if you ever talk to someone who does any type of pest management, they will always say they recommend prevention above all else because it's easier to keep them out than to get rid of them. So when you have all of these different issues in trying to remove cockroaches, people become desperate, and because of capitalism, people will capitalize on that. And so there are these electronic repellents for not just cockroaches, but also for mice and all of these different things, including flies and things like that. They're a scam. Do not buy them. They are not recommended by the FDA, and they do not work. They are just decorative plugs for your wall. Don't do it. It'll never move the needle or effectively do really anything, even to the behavior of an individual, let alone an entire population. What typically you'll do is some type of chemical treatment. We do not have a good biological agent to kill cockroaches at this time. So really chemical pesticides is all we have. And there's a couple different things that we can do. So there's aerosol. So this is actually spray cans and you're spraying surfaces. You have baits that the insect will actually feed on, and sometimes bring back to the brood. And you have things like powders. So boric acid is a desiccant. So it just dries them out and then they end up dying. So these are our options. Oftentimes you use all three in one setting. Okay, for next, more Blatodia. So remember, the Blatodia are both the cockroaches and the termites. So while cockroaches are social insects, termites are eusocial. So you can think of this as they are like honeybee hives where you have your queen and you have different castes. So castes are just the roles that these different individuals are playing. Now, unlike bees, with termites, the castes have a variety of different forms. So they all look very different, even though they're from the same species and even the same colony. They have bacterial symbionts in their gut that allow them to eat wood. So they actually, we call it a rumen. It is nearly, or I shouldn't say identical, but it's the same mechanism for a cow's rumen, right? So they have this bacteria that helps that break down. Termites are difficult because they're what we call subterranean. So that means they live underneath the dwelling that they are infesting. So most people don't know that they have a termite infestation until it's too late. And then they have to go and fix everything after. So usually the evidence that you see is this powder that is found below where they're infesting, because they're actually like, it's their frass and all of the material that's kind of sloughing off while they're feeding. When you are looking for termites, sometimes you're looking for that powder. Other times you're just looking for an ideal resource. And so any type of damp wood, termites love it. So termites will only eat already decomposing wood. So treated wood is actually the best way to keep them out. But if you have wet wood, you pull it away from the wood you don't want to get infested, so that way you don't have termites. I always say that there's two types of homes. So you'll have homes that have termites or homes that will have termites. Okay, and it really just is how homes are made of wood, and that's just kind of the way it works. And just like cockroaches, the best way to get rid of them is to prevent them from colonizing in the first place. So if your neighbor has termites, they're subterranean, their tunnels are likely below your house as well. So it's a matter of time for them to find yours. So if you own a property, be sure to do preventative care with termites. Even if you have a concrete foundation, they'll move up the concrete. So you can actually see that in that second image on the lower right, or the first image on the lower right corner of the slide. Okay, so again, pesticide or prevention is ideal. If you do end up getting termites, you can have the wood treated with pesticide. Some wood you can already have treated with pesticide. There are different methods for treatment now than there has been in the past. So instead of using an aerosol spray, there's now some powders that are being put down. So things are constantly changing. The big thing is that this is a major corporation. People are getting paid billions of dollars to treat termites across the year. Because again, there's two types of homes, right? There's the ones that have termites, the ones that will get it. So these pesticides are constantly being put down, whether we like it or not. Group that are important to talk about are ants. So they're of the order Hymenoptera, so they are close relatives of bees and wasps. Like bees, they are eusocial, I should say, like termites. And they will have their queen, and then they'll have their different castes. All of these ants here are considered urban pests, but the carpenter ant is the pest that causes infrastructure damage. And they can completely eliminate entire structures. So I say this from experience. I purchased a home a couple years back with a garage that they said that there was termites. I looked, I was like, there's no termites here. I didn't pull behind one of the walls and see that there was carpenter ants. When I finally got to it about a year later, there was no wall left. I pulled the cover down, and I was looking outside. And so they can be very, very challenging in terms of actual infrastructure. The great thing is carpenter ants are really easy to get rid of because they colonize the resource that they are infesting. So if you can find the colony, you can get rid of the infestation, unlike termites, which are under the ground. Okay, and you can usually buy carpenter ant pesticides at Home Depot or Lowe's and places like that. So they are very, very challenging, but not hard to get rid of. The other ants, on the other hand, you will usually see them in your house. They're usually nuisance insects, and they aren't necessarily causing anything other than an annoyance. So you'll try removing the food resource and they'll still be going to it. My brother had odorous house ants consistently for multiple years. They would go away and they'd come back, and they were going for like random things in his cabinet, like chemicals, which was interesting. But they will create these lines, and you can see like all these little ants in a row. And so it's annoying. However, it's not going to cause damage. And so taking your landlord to court over something like a pavement ant or an odorous house ant is not going to hold up very well, because they're just nuisance, and it's usually because there's some type of food product that they're trying to access. The fleas, and fleas are blood-feeding parasites that will exist on primarily your pets, but they can bite you as well. There are different flea species for different hosts. So there is a flea for cats, fleas for dogs, and even fleas for humans, even though this is less common. And when we're talking about the issues of fleas, usually it's associated with your pet. Your pet has picked it up from outside, and then it ends up getting into your carpet. And now you have a completely sustained life cycle. The life cycle gets, or the population gets high enough that you start getting bit, and it becomes a problem. So oftentimes when we see fleas in urban entomology, it also crosses over into the medical legal side, where we're looking at potential neglect in these situations, either for pets or even that extends to human kids and elderly as well. And so just for your information, you're not going to have to know this on an exam or anything, but you can actually tell what species of flea you have based off of their little mustache. So these little bristles that are underneath their mouth. And we use their morphology, so both their shape and their size, to actually identify what host that individual has. Next thing that I want to talk about is another blood feeder. But unlike fleas, the bed bugs do not jump. So one thing I neglected to talk about in the last slide is they can jump exceptionally high. So you can watch that video and actually watch that. Bed bugs are not the same. So the easiest way actually to tell the difference between fleas and bed bugs is, one, bed bugs are hemipteran, so they have the siphoning mouth part, and that's actually how they feed. But their body's flattened dorsoventrally, so that way they look flat from the top. And like fleas, they can carry pathogens based off of the fact that they're picking up blood from their host. Okay. The issue is we're not exactly sure if they're transmitting diseases. Okay, so they have the potential to transmit pathogens, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll turn into disease. So I'll talk about this in the next video, because that's really important in environmental forensic ento. And bed bugs are also unique. I shouldn't say unique. They're specific because they need a blood meal to molt. So ticks do this as well, but those aren't insects, right? So for insects, bed bugs will feed on a resource, and then they'll shed their exoskeleton and get a little bigger. And they'll do this over and over and over again until they're ready for reproduction. Bed bugs also, if you get them on your materials, so in this lower right hand corner is a mattress with bed bug eggs. If you see that, you get rid of the mattress. There are also pesticides that you can spray down, and actually you can use preventative pesticides as well that are really helpful in either preventing, so if you know that there's an exposure, you can spray your stuff to make sure you don't get bed bugs, or getting rid of it altogether. And this is where having that secondhand furniture is not a good idea, because you will have furniture like computer chairs that have little folds in it, and you won't see all of the bed bug eggs, and then you'll bring it home. And then once it's home, they'll get into your other things like your mattress, which you don't want. So you have to be really careful of that. Okay, we have talked about multiple insects that are blood feeding, right? So both fleas and bed bugs. We also have mosquito bites that can be mistaken for bed bug and flea bites. And so usually when we're talking about bed bug feeding, it's going to be based off of how you are laying. Bed bugs don't like to climb on you. They like to climb on surfaces around you. So if you like to sleep on your side, you're going to see a line of bug bites all the way down your back. If you like to sleep on your back, it's going to be down your side. Okay, so usually it is in a line and is somewhere on basically the main trunk of the body. They don't like to be on legs because in your sleep you will tend to move your legs and arms. So they want to stay in the most stable spot because they have to put their siphon in you and pull blood for a little bit. Now, flea bites are usually on lower extremities. So they can jump very high, but they can't jump up to your torso, and they're not going to climb on your body either. So with dogs and cats, they will get bitten all over their body because they're very low to the ground. Humans, not so much. So if you see it on your lower body, it's oftentimes going to be a flea. It's also indiscriminate. So there's no pattern in where they're biting or anything like that. It is just happens to be in those areas. Now, if you have a small dog and it has fleas and you're holding it, you could get bit. So it's not always true that it's only on the lower legs. Like they're not preferring that area of the body. They're just happening to land there. And the mosquito bites, they can be quite literally anywhere. For some people, they have specific spots. Like for me, mosquitoes love the back of my legs. It's actually based off of your bacterial profile. So having a mosquito bite doesn't necessarily have any pattern. The difference in color is the bed bug bites and the flea bites tend to be much darker than the mosquito bites, right? Unless you've been scratching at that mosquito bite. So if it's just a bump, it's very unlikely to be a bed bug or a flea bite. Flea bites also tend to be a little bit bigger than bug bites because they're actually using like a comb to bite into your skin rather than a sucking part that goes in. All right, so now that I talked a lot about the whole who's responsible for an infestation and what insects we tend to see during those infestations, I wanted to talk about off-label pesticide use because usually these things are multi-layered, right? So someone will complain about a pest to their landlord and the landlord will send someone out and that person might be like, it might be their first day and they barely have their certifications and then they use the incorrect pesticide or worse, they put it in the wrong place. Okay, so there are a lot of different types of pesticides and oftentimes they are specific for different species. So for example, this Invicta Gold, it's cockroach gel, but it's specific for German cockroaches. And the reason why is because the bait that they use is something that, or the ingredients in the bait that attracts them is specific to German cockroaches. So you can't use this for other species of cockroaches. Okay, so in different states, you'll have this situation where you need to choose your appropriate pesticide, but there is also the requirement for the individual to have specific licensure. So they need to, like I am an entomologist, I have my PhD in entomology, I train entomologists, including those who are going to put down pesticides, and I even train them how to do it. I myself am not legally allowed to place pesticides down as a service, okay? Because every state has their own license that you need to follow, and I'm not certified to do that. That's simply it. I just can't. I'm not allowed to. And what is important is if you have the wrong person or the wrong product, then it becomes a federal violation. So there is a lot of restriction around this because these pesticides are not to be messed with. They can be dangerous to human health and they can be dangerous to environmental health. And so we'll actually, again, talk about environmental contamination in the next one. So when we talk about that, you can think back to this as well. So when you have an urban entomologist in discussion in a case regarding off-label pesticide use, the goal of that entomologist is to talk about what type of pesticide should they put down, where should they have put it, who should be responsible for placing this down. And so they would just be more of a consult rather than someone who is, going in and collecting insects and things like that. I just kind of wanted to share an example of a situation where you have landlord-tenant issues as well as this off-label pesticide use infraction. Okay, so in this particular case, it was in Florida, and the tenant had complained in March that trash facilities in 2022, that facilities were not well kept and there was a lot of fly issues. Specifically, they were phorid flies. And the individual was knowledgeable enough to know that there was a lot of people in that building, there was a lot of trash, and this smelt really bad and could be drawing things in. The landlord actually said that they do preventative pesticide treatment and that there's nothing to be concerned about. April 19th, 2022, there was a cockroach spotted. Okay, they had collected this cockroach. It turned out to be female. It had an oothiki. It actually deposited the oothiki while in collection. So the landlord then placed baits along the inside cabinets. So as you can see at the top right here, you have on the left-hand photo, you have the joint here of the cabinet open, and you can see the arrows are placed the bait inside that joint. And so the issue with this placement is that when the door is shut, so you can see that on the right side in the circle, that you have bait sealed in here. What also ended up being important is that the bait that was placed in on April 20th was never touched. So they put this down, the bait didn't work. It turned out it was that bait that I had shown you in the last discussion, which is an issue because this is an Australian cockroach, not a German cockroach, so it's not going to eat the bait. And so they ended up putting the bait down again. They said it's going to be okay, perfect, we did what we can, and then once mid-July hit, there was a cockroach seen every single night. And so the Australian cockroach does have a long life cycle, just like the American cockroach and the Australian cockroach. But the issue was there was a huge explosion of them. You shouldn't be seeing them that often if it wasn't an infestation. And so pest control was called again, and they ended up placing an aerosol and another set of bait, which was the incorrect bait, and they did some dusting, so they used borax around. And the issue is they used all of these types of pesticides off-label, which becomes a problem because they just broke in multiple federal violations. And so a report was written, given to the landlord, and this was, that act where the landlord has a right to respond to these types of things, and the tenant ultimately got to break their lease and leave the apartment. So all in all, the important thing is if this does happen to you, document everything. It's really important. You can break a lease or you can take them to court for damages. Okay. Nuisance claims. So we already talked about ants being a potential nuisance rather than an infestation. And so when we're talking about nuisances, we're often affiliating this with something called the Right to Farm Act. And so this is a law that prevents people from suing farmers because of an increase in nuisance animals. So these can be things like houseflies, which are just annoying, and things like stable flies, which actually bite. So oftentimes when you have livestock, these insects are naturally high in abundance because they're attracted to the animal. So the farmer has a right to have those animals, and therefore those come with the territory. What it doesn't protect is if a farmer doesn't control their property in a way that actually mitigates that. So just like in stored product entomology, you have this economic threshold. Once that happens, you need to be controlling that population. So if there is a lawsuit to a farmer, the question is going to be, are you appropriately managing your nuisance pest population? And oftentimes it's yes, because the farmer does not want these animals, these insects, these animals slash insects, but they don't want them because they carry pathogens and they disrupt the animal and cause distress, right? So oftentimes they're doing this. So nuisance claims are usually in this realm or in the realm of poor management of property. So in things like hoarding homes or apartments that might be creating nuisance pests around. So it's the same idea. But farmers are particularly protected. And then finally, finally, we have mortuary neglect. And this is the colonization of actual human remains that may have been attempted to be embalmed, but maybe weren't completely embalmed, or weren't even though they should have, or they weren't kept in cold storage, and basically were placed in an environment that did not protect the remains from being colonized. So when this ends up happening, an urban entomologist would come and check the conditions that would have been conducive for this colonization, and then determine whether or not the mortuary or mortician had the ability to prevent this colonization from happening, because sometimes it's just an accident. That is all for urban forensic entomology. The next video you should watch is environmental forensic entomology.